Order. Welcome to today's session of the Business and Trade Select Committee, scrutinising licences for arms exports to Israel. I'm very grateful to you ministers for joining us this afternoon, and you have brought with you some officials. Thank you very much to Kate Joseph, to Stephen Lillie, and thank you very much indeed. We're also very grateful for the presence today of our sister committees from the Foreign Affairs Committee, from the International Development Committee, and from the Defence Committee. We have with us Mr. Dessy, Mr. Ford, and Ms. Harding from those committees. And the matter before us could not be more grave. Our time today is very short, and there is a debate in the House about this matter on Monday. It's the duty of this committee, therefore, to make sure that the House goes into that debate as well informed as possible. And so to everybody on the committee, I would say that what is needed today is short forensic questions, and what we need from ministers today are concise and succinct answers. The questions that we explore today are before the courts. Mr. Speaker has therefore granted our hearing today a sub judice waiver so that we are free to roam where committee members would like to go. As in all things, ministers are bound by the ministerial code and its injunctions to be as open as possible with Parliament and to be mindful of the ruling of the 10th of July 2017 in paragraph 33 of the Judicial Review ruling that political accountability and responsibility to parliamentary scrutiny is the essential component in the legality of our framework for arms export licensing. Everybody on this committee was appalled by the events of the 7th of October last year. We deplore the kidnap and the keeping of hostages and the wanton destruction and loss of life which has ensued. Minister Alexander, perhaps I could start with you. Thank you very much indeed for supplying the committee at 13:12 today with an updated set of statistics about arms export licences. I'm conscious that the information that your department has provided to the courts in the outline position statement of the 12th of November 2024 at paragraph 4 is probably more detailed than the information that you have supplied to the House of Commons. And so I'd be very grateful if we could write to you after this meeting just to seek more details about the nature of the arms licences which have been suspended and the nature of the licences which are still open. But is there anything you want to add just very briefly at this stage about which licences have been suspended and the nature of the licences that are still open?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Firstly, can I applaud and recognise the sentiments that you describe in terms of the importance of parliamentary scrutiny generally ahead of the debate on Monday and the important work of this committee in that regard. What we inherited on coming to office on July the 4th was an imperfect system of data release, candidly, within the Department of Business and Trade. I know that that was a matter of some consternation in a previous session of this committee. And in light of that, I was determined to ensure that we were able to provide the committee today with the most up-to-date figures in relation to figures which I now understand are in the public domain from October the 7th, the horrendous events that you describe, until last Friday, 4 days ago. That being said, it's a matter of regret to me that we were only able to get those figures to you at the time that you describe, but I nonetheless wanted to prioritise the Israeli export control licensing data to make sure that the committee was cited on it in the course of today. In terms of those licences that have been suspended, I would perhaps ask that Kate Joseph, our Director General who leads on this area of work, speaks to the detail of the release, and I'd be very happy to offer any views once she's gone through the table that you've got in front of you.
Let me read the information that you supplied to the court. It says the red licences included components for combat aircraft, military transport aircraft, military helicopters, targeting equipment, combat naval vessels and unmanned aerial vehicles, and technology for military goods. So even that level of detail is not in any release that has been supplied to Parliament. And just because there is so much to get through, I'm going to write to you and Kate in order to get that more detailed information if you're content with that. Thank you. Alison Griffiths.
Thank you. So, Ministers Doughty and Alexander, Are you still using the decision-making framework set out by the then Foreign Secretary in April 2024 when making licensing decisions under criterion 2C?
Yes, 2C continues to be the basis on which the decisions are taken by, in the case of the Department of Business and Trade, the Secretary of State for Business and Trade.
I would say that the Foreign Secretary informed the House on the 2nd of September very clearly that the government's rigorously followed every stage of the process which the previous Conservative government established. On the 2nd of September we also published a summary of the IHL assessment process to allow for greater transparency on our decision making, and he set out very clearly the facts that are part of that process, the way it works, and obviously the conclusions that were then reached as a result.
So those frameworks are based on the statement made by then Minister Trevelyan on the 8th of December 2021. That framework is still the framework that is in place today, is that correct?
Yes, so the approach, Chair, to applying criteria to C draws on the framework upheld in previous litigation, and that gathers information from a wide range of sources. So that includes information reporting from NGOs on the ground, reports from other FCDO desks, reporting the media, statements from the UN, NGOs and so on, reporting from HMBG, engagement with Israeli counterparts. It draws on a log of military incidents. There are a lot of factors that inform that process, and it's followed rigorously and properly.
So there hasn't been any innovation, refinement, development of that framework last declared by Lord Cameron since the new government has taken office?
So I obviously can't comment on the process and the way in which the previous government conducted it, and I'm not privy to.
So it was set out before the House on the 24th of April. It sounds very similar to the framework you've just enunciated. I just want to check there isn't anything else that you've added without us knowing.
No.
Criteria 2C states that the government will not issue export licences if there is a clear risk that the items might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. That's the basis on which the judgments have been reached.
Perfect. And then
we followed the criteria exactly as set out in the SLC
so we're looking
criteria.
at 4 streams of evidence, and we're assessing
Absolutely.
Capability,
and all of that
and
is balanced,
compliance.
Understood.
Yeah.
And
so
helps
not had
inform
any
decisions.
innovations,
Nope.
development, refinement since the government's taken office. Perfect. Alison, anything else you wanted to add to that?
Thank you.
No? Charlie Maynard?
Just to confirm, so the second stream is analysis of statements made by NGOs, international bodies and partner countries relating to Israel's adherence to IHL. Does that include the ICC and ICJ rulings?
We consider, the important role of the ICC and the ICJ, as we would any other evidence, as they obviously haven't come now to. The ICJ has not come to the definitive judgment on this. Obviously, they would inform any future processes, but we weigh them in the same way that we do all the other evidence that's there, and we take their roles very, very seriously.
So they're included?
Very
Thank you.
seriously.
And the date of the last IHL cell report?
Assessment 9 is currently been undergoing. It's about to report. It'll be considered in due course by ministers, and then obviously the findings of that will be taken in due course.
Okay.
So that's 9. There's obviously been assessment 7, which was the one that triggered the 2nd of September suspension decision. That concluded. That was between 25th of April and 19th of June. The licensing submissions went up on the 24th of July. Assessment 8 was between 20th of June and 31st of July 2024, and the licensing submissions were on the 2nd of October. And as I said, assessment 9 is currently underway.
Okay, so just the end date for assessment 8 was when?
The dates I have here, Chair, it took place between the 20th of June and the 31st of July, and the licensing submissions were on the 2nd of October.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Doughty, can you provide us with information about the legal basis for the suspensions, and what specific evidence and analysis that was used to support the Secretary of State's view that breaches of international humanitarian law may have occurred?
Thank you for your question. The Export Control Act, which you'll be familiar with, requires ministers to give guidance about the general principles to be followed when exercising licensing powers. The current guidance, of course, is the SELC criteria, which was announced in 2001. Obviously, criterion 2C that we've spoken about already states the government won't grant a licence if there is a clear risk that items might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of IHL. And on the basis of an IHL assessment, the Foreign Secretary concluded that concerns about Israel's compliance and commitment in areas of humanitarian relief and treatment of detainees gave cause for concern about its attitude and approach to the conduct of hostilities, and that informed the conclusion that the clear risk threshold was satisfied, and he then obviously advised the Secretary of State for Business and Trade that the relevant licences should be suspended, and that was what he announced on the 2nd of September. So that's the basis, that's the process, and we obviously gave a summary of that process as well at the time. Okay,
and can you set out the evidence and the reasoning that led to that? So any of the information that you became aware of, because obviously that position has moved from where it was before. So is there new information that you've taken on board? Is it a new evaluation process that you're using? Or is it about sort of looking further over time and looking at a pattern, for example?
Well, we consider a whole series of issues, as I set out earlier. As I said, particularly the review highlighted concerns and breaches in the areas of humanitarian access and the treatment of detainees. So these were the two specific areas, and obviously that inferred also a question about a wider commitment to acting in line with international humanitarian law, and that was the decision.
Information available to the prior assessments, and it was just reassessed, or is it new evidence that you looked at?
It was the information that we had available, Chair. Obviously, I don't have access to information that previous governments had, and obviously we took into account events that took place since we came into office.
But you won't have disregarded the evidence that was available in IHL 7.
Well, we get access to a lot of information, but I don't have the exact details of obviously decisions they made. I mean, maybe Stephen could speak on the previous information.
Yes, Chair. In many ways, each IHL assessment builds on the previous one. So it takes account of what has been in the previous ones, adds on the additional information. So when the new government took office, as officials, we were providing an IHL assessment that took account of the broad picture, but then specifically provided comment on events that had taken place since the previous IHL assessment.
So in the outline argument from the Business and Trade Secretary of State 12th of November, it says that a threshold of clear risk had been passed, and I guess what we're trying to understand is that a different evaluation of information that was already available, or was it new evidence that had accumulated? And if so, what was that evidence? So, for example, if that ran until the end of July, you will have had the benefit of the ICJ advisory note issued on the 19th of July. So, was it new information that tipped into clear risk, or was it a different evaluation of old information?
It's, in many ways, it is both, Chair. It is a fully up-to-date assessment for the new government. The way that the process works is that officials compile the assessment, drawing on a wide variety of sources involving legal advice, but it is not a legal assessment, it is a policy assessment. It then goes to ministers, and ministers themselves make the final decision. Do they consider that this crosses the clear risk threshold? And the decision of previous ministers, as is a matter of record, was that it did not, and the decision of this government is that it does.
And I should point out, Chair, of course, this was a process that the Foreign Secretary announced right as soon as we came into office, and he wanted to consider all of that evidence, including any new information that had come into place, make sure that was considered properly in line with our export licensing criteria, and then provided the advice on that basis, which led to the suspension.
So just tell me if I've got this wrong. So you're saying that it was a different judgment rendered on information that was already available, plus new information that was available in that assessment window?
It's all of the information together. So it's, I mean, because obviously new events had occurred, obviously it's an assessment of what had gone before, and then obviously the Foreign Secretary reviewed that very, very carefully and took that process incredibly seriously, and then gave the advice to the Secretary of State for Business and Trade. Yeah. Sarah, do continue.
So I think just moving on to the understanding that, so thank you for clarifying that. Is one breach not enough? So can you explain why there is a partial suspension over an entire blanket suspension, and how that decision has been made? Because at the moment, you know, there's clearly some information that you have which has been applied in one particular way. So are you able to enlighten us on that?
Well, we've suspended licences to Israel for items that we believe might be used in carrying out or facilitating IDF military operations in the Gaza conflict. And there are a number of export licences which we've assessed that are not for military use in the current conflict and therefore don't require suspension. So this is a rigorous assessment of all of those individual licences, extant licences, and of course the consideration of new licences that have come through that's highlighted in the data that Mr. Alexander has set out. And you consider each one on its merits, and you consider it on the evidence that's provided, and also crucially what that item is. And I think there is some misunderstanding about the number of licences and what they're for. And there's obviously a whole range of items here that includes, body armour and other materials for use in the food industry, and so there are a whole series of things which are not what people would consider normally arms exports, but they come under the export licensing criteria. So obviously you have to assess where is that being used. Is that being used in Gaza? Is that being used in a way that could constitute a clear risk of violation of IHL? We assessed that a number of those were, and those were the licences that were suspended.
Okay.
Can you give us an example of an export licence that you had allowed to stay open, where you came to a judgment that there wasn't a risk of an IHL breach?
Yep, absolutely. There is, for example, some export licences relating to civilian use. That covers a range of products: food testing, chemicals, telecoms, data equipment. So there are a number of licences that wouldn't fall within the kind of items that drew us to concern about they might be used in that violation of IHL.
And have you drawn a boundary around Gaza specifically? In the sense that...
this was a consideration of those specific, but obviously we consider all arms export licences, all export licences in the round in relation to the criteria. So we consider all the criteria against all of them. Obviously there are some things that naturally don't fit within a grounds for either a refusal in the first place or a suspension at any one point.
So are there any open licences still which relate to material that is being used in any way in Gaza?
So there are currently no extant licences that we assess might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law.
So the question was different.
That's subject, Chair, to the specific measures set out in Parliament, excluding exports to the global F-35 programme from the scope of the suspension. So that's been
are there
stated.
any open licences relating to material that is being used in Gaza?
Not for military use.
Not for military use, no.
But for other use?
Not that they would be in a way that's risking a lack of compliance with IHL.
I understand
that's our understanding of the current assessment. But obviously, there's a current assessment going on, and when that concludes, this is the whole point. This is a rolling process. We're constantly keeping this under review, and not just in relation to Gaza, of course, in relation to all of our export licences around the world.
Yeah, but there are open licences for things which are being used in Gaza.
I would say just to add that we know of. The open licences that remain, as the Minister has said, are for items that are for dual-use goods and have a civilian application, such as equipment for telecoms, chemical manufacturing and so on. Those are not licences that would be for use in Gaza. The licences that have been suspended are those that are for military use in Gaza.
So it is possible that there are licences open for things which are being used in Gaza?
So I don't think so.
Not for military use. Or not
If
in
you
a
like,
way that would risk.
The threshold and the boundary that has been drawn is military use in Gaza. And so if your question is implicitly, are there open licences which could be facilitating and allowing military use?
That isn't my question. My question is really much simpler than that. My question is, are there licences for anything which is currently being used in Gaza? And Kate Joseph, you're saying not that you know of.
So, as Minister said, the threshold that we've applied is for military use in Gaza, in line with the strategic export licensing criteria. So those are the criteria that we apply, and in line with those criteria, there are no extant licences for equipment for military use in Gaza. Otherwise, the situation is that there are extant licences for Israel as a whole, and because that is not part of the assessment, because the assessment is based on the strategic export licensing criteria that we apply to each licence, the focus is on military use in Gaza.
But it's not a complicated question. It's not a trick question. It is just, are there licences open for things that are being used in Israel? I think the answer I'm taking away is yes.
Forgive me, is it Israel or Gaza?
Gaza, I'm sorry. So are there licences that are open for anything that is being used in Gaza? And the answer is there could be. Not for military use, I agree, but it is possible that there are things that are being used in Gaza which are attached to an open licence issued by us.
I don't think that these are I mean, I think the question is what things. It's not that's not the assessment that we make, and the items that we look at are items for largely commercial use or civilian use in Israel.
Okay, Richard Ford.
I wonder, aside from the strategic export licensing criteria, aside from that, when it comes to dual-use goods, what assessment is being conducted of possible use of dual-use goods in Gaza?
That's entirely covered by the assessment that we make. So we don't make, when we receive an export licence, we look at whether it's a military or a non-military good, but we apply the same criteria in assessing each export licence in terms of whether it's a military good or non-military good. So that will have been part of the assessment process.
On that point, you're describing a process which is looking at export licences across the whole GOMAT then? It's not just purely Israel and Gaza you're looking at, so you're constantly reviewing, I assume, elsewhere conflicts such as the one that the Saudis are involved in. This is not a process that's designed specifically for Israel, is that right?
Yes, that is correct. But we have a specific process that we follow to assess compliance with international humanitarian law in Gaza for Israel that Minister Doughty has set out.
So if you like, there's a policy focus specifically on Gaza, and in that context, arms export licences and the operation of the CELC in relation to Israel. But you're absolutely right in saying the international humanitarian law compliance assessment process, of which Minister Doughty spoke, while it sits within the FCDO, was set up to advise on international humanitarian law in this conflict, following a methodology established in light of the judicial review of arms exports to Saudi Arabia during the Yemen conflict, known as the CAT judgments, after the claimant in that judicial review campaign against the arms trade. So, if you like, the CELC framework is general in its application. The methodology that is used in relation to the international humanitarian law assessment reflects the judgment in a previous judicial review case in relation to the conflict in Yemen.
Okay, thank you. So just to finish off this question, can you just, Mr. Doughty, take us through the chain of reasoning that took you from the Foreign Secretary's judgment that there were two grounds in particular for suspecting IHL lack of compliance to a decision to suspend? Just talk us through that chain of reasoning that was followed.
I mean, essentially, it's that, the CELC produces the evidence, they consider all those points that I raised previously. The Foreign Secretary then is given a submission that sets out the assessment of the risk and whether they believe that there's a risk, and then he takes a judgment on that and then writes to the Secretary of State for Business and Trade to set that out, and that led then to the decision which suspended those licences. So it's as straightforward as that. There's a rolling assessment process. Yeah. We're in the 9th phase of that now. That then provides advice. He considers it. That then indicates whether or not he then writes to the Secretary of State for Business and Trade to recommend a suspension or not.
So my understanding is that there were basically two judgments that were confirmed. So concerns that Israel was failing to provide adequate essential supplies to civilians, and second, credible claims of mistreatment of detainees. Mm-hmm. So those were judgments on things that had happened in the past that led to an inference of a clear risk in the future. Is that basically correct? Yes. Okay. The third piece of that puzzle is then around an assessment of the conduct of hostilities, and the judgment was that there was no judgment, in a sense, that despite the evidence that is potentially available, if not obvious, there was no judgment made by His Majesty's government on the conduct of hostilities. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
But as I said, those two decisions about the detainees and about the humanitarian access obviously give rise to a wider concern about Israel's willingness to comply with international humanitarian law. So therefore, that decision, influences them, the wider approach that's taken, and effectively it would have led to the same suspension of licences. So it's in terms of the outcome, it's the same. Yeah. But obviously, we have to apply the evidential tests on these things very, very carefully, and obviously there are often questions around establishing the exact evidence around, say, proportionality or intent of an individual strike or incident or otherwise, and that's why the judgments around conduct, although we're all appalled by scenes that we've seen and destruction and horrors that we've seen, and the Foreign Secretary and others have been very, very clear about that, but you have to apply these strict tests, and that's why we came to the conclusion that on detainees and humanitarian access there was an absolutely clear and categorical risk. That gives rise to a wider concern about a willingness to comply with IHL.
Because it was clearer for you to make a judgment about intent.
It's a clearer and more definitive process.
Thank you. So just feeding that back to you. So two clear reasons for the partial suspension of licences. Failure to provide adequate essential supplies to civilians, and credible claims of mistreatment of detainees. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's
just to correct. It's not a partial suspension of license. There are some licences that have been suspended and some that haven't, Agreed. And that's based on assessment of each individual licence.
Agreed. So, as of the 30th of September, the UN has stated its UNITAR, United Nations Satellite Centre, has stated there are 163,778 structures in Gaza. 52,564 of those structures have been completely destroyed. That's 32% of all buildings in Gaza have been destroyed. Another 18,900 severely damaged, etc., etc. Yeah, we have tens of thousands of people dead, and yet that does not qualify as a reason.
So we're very clear, in the scale of destruction that you describe. I mean, it is appalling. At the level of civilian deaths, completely unacceptable. That's exactly why we called for an immediate ceasefire. It's one of the first things that the Foreign Secretary did, and has consistently raised, along with other ministerial colleagues, concerns directly with the Israeli government and colleagues, and why we've had so much engagement with partners across the region. What I will say is that it's always very, very challenging, and this does get into technical detail for a non-party to the conflict, because obviously this relies the assessment of, say, proportionality and intent. We can all, reach our own views around this, but in the end, that requires some understanding about what was going on in, for example, the targeting process or the decision about proportionality. So therefore, third parties often don't have access to that full picture of operational information that would allow you to reach a definitive judgment.
£2,000 bombs in an urban area. I mean, does that not send its own message to you about the inadequacy of a targeting framework?
As I've said, it's very, very clear to us that the definitive judgments we've been able to reach in those first two areas give rise to a wider concern about willingness to comply with IHL. So that's very, very clear.
But nothing yet in the conduct of hostilities gives rise to the same judgment.
Well, I think we all have very, very serious concerns, and what we've all seen, and we've all seen in this committee. But as I said, there's a technicality here about the way in which these processes do, the way the assessments are done, and the way in which then that those inform. But as I said, the actual outcome of this is the same. The licences were suspended.
I appreciate that, but there's a moral judgment as well.
Yeah, so I presume you are comfortable with the UN satellite imagery. You also have RAF flights. You've had hundreds of RAF flights flying over Gaza on a daily basis, so you can see the day-by-day destruction.
Maybe if Lord Coaker just wants to say about the RAF flights.
Sure, well, let me maybe finish my sentence. So I'm just trying to probe further as to why this doesn't qualify and why this is such an unknown, because you're seeing RAF flights, I think they've been flying over since, I think, more than 12 months now. So you're seeing day by day the destruction. You know it's more than 50,000 buildings destroyed. Why is this not qualifying as a criteria to stop doing this? And how are these buildings being knocked down? Because presumably it's by these planes dropping bombs.
So the reference is the BBC report of the 25th of October. The Royal Air Force has flown hundreds of surveillance flights over Gaza since last December, reportedly using Shadow R1 spy planes based in nearby Cyprus. I think the point that's being made is that we haven't got a shortage of information that is available to you about the scale of destruction.
No, I mean it's just. I mean just to say the purpose of the RF. I understand the point you're making is about the general picture, the horrific picture that it paints with respect to Gaza. I understand that. Just to clarify, the purpose of the RF flights was to look for the hostages and to see whether the hostages could be found by the use of the surveillance planes. That's the whole purpose of the RF planes.
Okay, following up on that, does that mean you're not analysing them for any other reason?
Well, in terms of that information that we use, the information we use is purely and simply used in terms of hostage and seeing whether we can locate the hostages and if necessary sharing that.
So you're not using it to work out what is going on in terms of destruction beyond that? That you're ignoring that data?
Well, we're not ignoring it, but we're not using it for that purpose.
But let's come back, Mr. Minister Doughty, then to the information that is coming into the current assessment window. I think there is a level of concern that a judgment is not being made about whether the conduct of hostilities is such that it creates future risk of IHL breaches. So is the data that is coming in from RAF flights and other sources going into that assessment framework?
I think that's a question for.
It's your cell.
Yeah, I mean, we consider a wide range of information. Lord Coaker has already answered on the specific point about the purpose of the RAF flights, but we consider all information from the United Nations, NGOs, media reporting, open source information. All of these factors are considered. But
RAF flights.
Well, in terms of the RF flights, that's not their purpose, but there's no... in terms of the evidence for what's going on and what is happening there, we've all seen the various pictures and seen the various images that are on our TV screens and beyond.
Yeah. Are you using the RAF information or not? To understand what is going on in terms of the destruction in Gaza?
Not specifically for that purpose. The purpose specifically is the hostages, yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Doughty, do you want to clarify whether that information... Have you sought that information from the Ministry of Defence?
In terms of officials' engagement with the MOD?
We have not sought it, to the best of my knowledge, Chair, we have not asked for that information from RAF flights. I don't think we are in any doubt as officials about the level of destruction that has happened, but the purpose of the IHL assessment has been to establish whether or not military exports to Israel for use in the conflict in Gaza would lead to a clear risk of IHL violation. We have reached the conclusion that there is a clear risk. That's the job of this process. I completely accept that there's a separate question about whether or not we can take a view as to whether the conduct of hostilities violates IHL, but for the purpose of applying the strategic export licence control, we have the information already that tells us we cannot export this military equipment.
And I should just point out practically that, of course, you have one piece of evidence in front of you, imagery or otherwise, but unless you understand what the process was leading to the targeting or a decision about target selection or proportionality, which we don't have, you can't make a definitive decision in that, and that's the challenge. But as I said, the net result here, of course, is that our decision under those two other criteria and the view that it's not, therefore, taking those obligations under IHL.
But you would accept that
there
comes a point when the conduct of hostilities is conducted in such a way that you are inevitably led to a conclusion that regardless of what a targeting process looks like, it's clearly inadequate, it's not working, and therefore creates a clear risk of an IHL breach in the future.
Well, we've been led to a clear conclusion that there is a risk that Israel is not
not on the
complying with
grounds
IHL.
of conduct of hostilities.
On the two grounds that I've set out.
But not on the grounds of conduct of hostilities.
No, because we haven't been able to reach that definitive judgment.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of, let me just get that straight. So if we're not using the RAF imagery to make a determination, Minister, have we used the satellite imagery from the BBC and other independent sources who have estimated that more than 60% of the buildings in Gaza now are uninhabitable? Yeah. And surely that's disproportionate, and surely therefore that constitutes a breach of IHL.
I mean, we as I say, we're not in any way disputing the level of destruction caused, and we're not in any way taking that lightly. But part of the challenge we face is around the nature of international humanitarian law, which is a relatively flexible body of law, which has a threshold that is much higher than many people appreciate. But we make every effort as officials to present ministers with the information that allows them to take a decision. But it is for that reason that we focus on the question of detainees and the question of humanitarian access, because there we do have the information that allows us to make a clear determination that is is going to be less disputed.
Which is a clear line of sight on evidence of intent, essentially.
Yeah.
Yes, and we don't have access to all of that in the contact side.
Matt Weston.
Just coming on that, Chair, I just want to go back to other licences and say the use of earth moving or ground clearing equipment such as bulldozers and diggers and so on. If they were shown to be used to be clearing farmland that could be producing foods for the people of Gaza to live off, and those products were being supplied by UK companies, would that licence be questionable under any UK legislation?
I mean, there's a clear criterion number 8, Ms. Weston, which is sets out the economic situation and sustainable development of the importing country, takes into account whether a transfer would undermine the economy or seriously hamper sustainable development of a recipient. So, there are a whole series of criteria here which are considered as part of this process, but the large focus in this regard is on 2C. But I don't know if
set out which could be used in military operations in the current conflict in Gaza.
I understand. Thank you. Just to move on. The government stated in the High Court that a team within FCDO had reached the conclusion that there was insufficient information to decide either way in 411 of 413 incidents against international humanitarian law that have been considered. That's 99.5% of all cases, just the 2 that the government has found to have been to have challenged the law. Given that 137 journalists have been killed, given, as we've heard, 60% of the urban area has been destroyed or damaged, uninhabitable, given that we had 3 United Kingdom citizens killed in the World Central Kitchen strike, why is the government operating a presumption of innocence rather than a principle of precaution? A question for Minister Doughty.
Because, and again, without in any way making light or suggesting that we don't take those cases very seriously, the way that the clear risk criterion operates under the strategic export licence criteria is we have to have concrete evidence that IHL is being violated, and it is a reality that deaths and destruction do not automatically equate to IHL violation. IHL is the law of warfare, and it involves those things. But as we have said, there are many other reasons, there are 2 other key reasons why we doubt Israel's commitment to comply with IHL, and that allows us then to apply the clear risk criterion. And that is our responsibility now, is to ensure that military equipment does not go to the IDF for military use in Gaza. And we could, if we had the evidence, we could come to that conclusion through a different route, but we have come to it through the most direct and most robust route that we can.
So what attempts are you making to, we just talked at some length really about the use of RAF spy planes, it seems that we've got some information. It might be in a different department, but there is information available to the UK government. What other sources are you using to help you in that determination of the 411 incidents? So I'm thinking organisations, open source organisations such as Bellingcat, for example, and the United Nations Satellite Centre.
I mean, again, it's that absence of understanding the intent and the decision-making process on the other side. I mean, I should just say on the World Central Kitchen incident, I mean, it was utterly appalling. We said so. The Foreign Secretary's obviously engaged with the families of the British aid workers who lost their lives in that incident, and we've obviously raised this on a number of occasions directly with the Israeli government. So, but the having one piece of information doesn't mean you have the definitive full picture, and in some ways that reflects the answer that we gave to the chair a few moments ago.
But Minister Doughty, I would suggest that the intent, and this is where trained eyes that I don't have, looking at this evidence, would be able to determine that that was intentional to take out that residential building or to destroy that farm or whatever, because you can tell by the nature of the debris that is left behind because of the nature of the device that's been used. Isn't it clearer than we're making out?
Without that full picture, without understanding what was going on the other side, you cannot have that definitive judgment, and that's the difficulty. It doesn't get away from the horror or the evidence that you see before you, that we can all see with our own eyes, and that's what very much we reflected when we spoke about that tragic incident and so many of the other tragic incidents. But in terms of the very specific processes that we have in terms of those criteria and how they're assessed, that's the challenge.
If you're dropping
but with a 2,000-pound bomb into a densely urban area, I mean, what do you need to understand about the intent in order not to come to a judgment that that was just completely wrong?
But I mean, there's a question of saying it is completely wrong versus saying, is it a violation of international humanitarian law? That sounds callous, but that is the difficult judgment that we have to make. And
so the judgment you've arrived at is that that was potentially a legal act of war?
The judgment that we are making, we are not setting out as officials to provide a complete analysis of Israel's compliance with IHL. We are setting out to establish whether, for the purpose of exporting, there is a clear risk that UK exports would violate the strategic export license criteria through a violation of IHL. We have a process which has provided advice to the Foreign Secretary, who has concluded that we do not have that confidence that IHL will not be violated. We have suspended the licenses as a result, and that is on a robust basis where there is less scope for dispute about what has and hasn't happened.
Sorry, the intent, though, surely, is that the IDF wants to raise Gaza. The Israeli ambassador to the UK even went on record and said, what did the UK, what did Britain do to Dresden? And therefore the logic of that is that they want to flatten and destroy Gaza. That is not what we support, is it?
Well, no, because we support a ceasefire. And that was the first thing that we did coming into government. And we commissioned this review. We've made sure that we started the funding to UNRWA. We've taken a whole series of decisions, and by the way, of course, not just in relation to Gaza, but also in terms of the sanctions that we've done on activities and individuals in the West Bank too. We're the first call for a ceasefire in Lebanon. So we've had a very, very consistent approach that we do not believe that this conflict is a way to solve any issues between Israel and Palestinians or Lebanon or anybody else. This is a very, very clear position of the government, and we've argued for a ceasefire from day one. So of course we don't support that.
Very briefly, Sarah Edwards.
Thank you. So just on that point, so on the 12th of November, the Secretary of State said that that Israel is not committed to comply with in international humanitarian law. That was the decision that was made. Therefore, under Article 7 of the Arms Trade Treaty, it doesn't talk about this clarification of intent, it talks about could be used. And that's the key word, could be used for serious violations of international humanitarian law. So I'm just struggling to understand how this is about the prediction of its use, not, as you have formally stated, whether or not you can verify it has happened. So I'm just drawing your attention to those two paradoxes.
Well, I mean, we're confident that the decisions that we've taken are compliant with all of our international legal obligations, and that includes a range of the measures. And fundamentally, we're applying the strategic export licensing criterion 2C, and those are the basis on which those decisions have been made.
Okay, further point on
How do the recent ICC arrest warrants impact your assessment of these export licences to Israel?
Well, obviously we respect Mr. Boynton, the independence of the International Criminal Court in investigating and prosecuting the most serious crimes of international concern, parties to the Rome Statute. We take our obligations to that very, very seriously, as we do to the role of the ICJ too. In terms of the specific issues in relation to the SCLC, we will continue to take account of all of the relevant information. And the International Criminal Court's ruling, of course, is consistent with our own assessments that there is a risk that relevant exports might be used to commit or facilitate violations of international humanitarian law. So we take it as we do with all of the evidence that's provided.
Because you said there's an ongoing assessment just now, so that would be part of that
all the matters are considered as part of that rolling assessment process.
It was touched on earlier, but how were the ICJ advisory opinion and the associated professional measures, and also the US State Department report of the 10th of May, and the administration's threatened to suspend Westbound shipments, how were they taken into consideration, the government's decision to keep the large majority of export licences open to?
Again, we just have to go back to that principle that we consider each of these licences on their own merits, and then whether they comply with the strategic export licensing criteria. So each licence has been looked at.
Can I just perhaps clarify for the benefit of the committee? In the information that we've shared with the committee today, over half of the licences are non-military, and less than half of the extant military licences are for the IDF. So the perception that if the licences per se are open, notwithstanding the judgment of the Foreign Secretary and the decision of the Secretary of State for Business and Trade, I wouldn't want to leave the misapprehension that these were military goods, certainly military goods directed towards the conflict in Gaza.
Okay. And so more broadly, what discussions and information exchange are taking place between our allies, given Israel's actions, and, in terms of monitoring on the ground? How do we take into consideration what from other allies are seeing and are acting?
Each country has its own domestic export licensing processes, and each country has different legal systems. There are different processes in place, and there are going to be different judgments taken in different places. But we regularly discuss these issues with our allies all the time. The visits that we're taking within the region. I was discussing these issues with King Abdullah and fellow NATO members at the NATO summit, the Foreign Ministers Summit just last week. So, all of these matters are under consideration all the time, and we discuss them as we would any other matter with allies.
Okay, Antonia Banks.
Thank you, Chair. To Minister Doughty, according to the government's opening statement to the judicial review, the September ministerial decision on licences followed an assessment by the Foreign Secretary that Israel is overall not committed to compliance with international humanitarian law in Gaza, including in the conduct of hostilities. Why did this not lead to a suspension of all arms exports?
For the very reasons, Ms. Banks, that I've set out, which is that each licence is considered on its own merits. As Minister Alexander set out, a substantial number of these are not for military purposes, wouldn't even have any relevance or relation to Gaza. So they have to be considered on what they are, what they're used for, and that's the decision that was taken.
Are there any red lines that, if Israel crossed, would lead to the suspension of all licences, regardless of their end use?
They can comply with the licensing criteria?
Well, if, for example, you're arguing that body armour for journalists that can be exported to Israel, I wouldn't see that as being consistent with government policy. And in that sense, I think the risk of the blanket ban that you describe in relation to the strategic arms export licence regime would be that it would have unintended consequences. But I think I would, with respect, Mr. Chair, want to emphasise the fact that notwithstanding the important debate that the committee has had with us today as to the third of the criteria on which the Foreign Secretary reached his judgment and was advised ahead of his decision in September, the basis on which the Secretary of State for Business and Trade made his decision was unaffected by which of the three criteria the threshold was deemed to have been met by the State of Israel. And in that sense, even if there had been definitive evidence in terms of proportionality, intent, and a different judgment had been reached or been capable of being reached in relation to the conduct of the conflict, we would still, in all likelihood, be sitting with identical numbers that were shared with the committee today.
So, in a sense, there are no red lines?
No, the red lines have been established by a very clear sense that there is a risk of breach of international humanitarian law, and that has had the effect, the identical effect, that if a similar criteria had been reached in relation to the conduct of the conflict, would have found expression in those figures. So far from there being no red lines, the Foreign Secretary established a very clear red line in relation to what he judged was a significant risk in relation to the suspension of licences.
That's absolutely the process that was undertaken. And again, I point out that this was a process we launched on day one.
Yeah.
We considered the evidence, took a decision. It led to the suspension and a number of the licences.
Okay.
That's a clear material difference. So that is a line being crossed and a decision being taken as a result of it.
And there aren't exceptions within that framework of red lines that you've just set out?
When you describe exceptions, when you draw or sought to draw a distinction between moral and legal responsibilities, I sought to evidence earlier, the basis on which the Foreign Secretary is advised and then seeks to reach his judgment is set down very clearly in terms of both criteria 2C, which states that the government will not issue export licences if there's a clear risk that the items might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law.
That's very helpful.
So that affects the licences.
Yeah.
But in terms of the judgment that the Foreign Secretary reaches, that is informed by the criteria that we've sought to share with the committee. And notwithstanding the interest and natural revulsion at what we've witnessed in terms of the conduct of the conflict, it is very clear in terms of the steps that the assessment cell and then the Foreign Secretary is obliged to make on the basis of the previous judicial review case.
But this is very helpful. So there's an assessment of the risk of an IHL breach, and that then comes to you, and you have then got a framework of red lines that you've just set out. You've just said that framework of red lines are in 2C. There's an assessment that informs
the Foreign Secretary's opinion. Yeah. The Foreign Secretary then writes to the Secretary of State for Business and Trade, who then makes a judgment and determination in relation to licences.
Yeah, and that's the framework. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Monica.
Minister Doughty, there is no basis in the strategic export licensing criteria to permit export licences for partial compliance with international humanitarian law. But the decision to suspend some licences implies you judge only partial compliance with IHL. How do you square this with your framework for assessing applications under criteria 2C?
I'd go back to the point I made earlier. It's not partial suspension or partial compliance. It's that we decided to suspend a number of the licences, of all the licences, because some of them were not directly related to either the conflict or were items that have been described, or indeed we didn't judge them to be at risk of violations of IHL. The ones that we believed have been suspended. And indeed that's the criteria that's used for considering the new licences and the data that you've been provided. So it's the
point I was trying to make earlier, which was as soon as the Foreign Secretary reached a determination that there was that risk in terms of a breach of international humanitarian law, the effect of that in terms of the judgment that was then made by the Secretary of State and the Department of Business and Trade was identical to if there had been other grounds on which the Foreign Secretary had reached the same judgment.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got clear assessment of a potential breach of IHL. We've got a clear framework for basically suspending licences where that breach takes place, which brings us to the intriguing mystery of why F-35 parts are still being allowed to be exported. Rosie Writing.
And can you confirm that the government is reviewing the F-35 exemption? And if so, what is the scope of this review?
I'm so sorry, I missed the first part.
That's okay. Can you confirm if the government is reviewing the F-35 exemption and what is in the scope of this review?
The government is not currently reviewing the criteria. We've set out very clearly in our advice to the Business Secretary and to the Foreign Secretary why we thought it important that F-35 components for particular reasons were exempted from the licence regime. There are always discussions that go on, but there is no particular appetite anywhere for changes to that. It's been discussed at official levels. It requires international agreement with all the partner nations that are part of the F-35 international collaboration agreement. No doubt those discussions will continue, but as it stands, the desire for us to be exempted because of the nature of the international collaboration that the F-35 programme represents is why we'll continue to advise that we should exempt components from the licensing regime.
So there's no review underway of the F-35 carve-out?
If I could just sort of contextualise that slightly.
Before you do, Mr. Lillie, I just want to confirm with Minister Alexander that there is no current review underway of the F-35 carve-out.
Well, there's always a review. As I say, there's a constant review going on at the as we carry on. We look at various programmes, and the F-35 will be part of that as a review.
What I would say, Chair, is that as we do every time we do an IHL assessment, we then provide new advice in the light of that on the suspension, and as part of providing advice to the Foreign Secretary to give to Secretary of State DBT, we will need to advise him on whether to maintain the suspension of licences, and we will need to, as part of that, provide advice on how the F-35 fits in, and that will need to take account of whatever up-to-date information we have, which is not to say that it won't reach a different
So in a sense there is a review underway because you're in the process of updating your IHL.
Yes, so review with a small r is how I would characterise it.
So look, we just need to try and understand a little bit more about what is being exported here. So as you'd expect, we took the step of writing to Lockheed Martin to ask for evidence ahead of this session, and I received their reply last night. Lockheed Martin say that they are not authorised to release information about the programme without the approval of the Joint Programme Office, and the US Department of Defence has advised that any questions the committee has about the programme should be directed to the US government. Now, I would prefer not to do that, so we're going to ask you the questions, Minister Coaker, and Tom Dessy is going to lead the questioning.
Thank you very much. Before I come on to the F-35s, Minister Alexander, I know that I just wanted some clarification on context. I know that there are some in government who have been at pains to say that the UK is not the primary source of military weaponry. In fact, it's US and Germany, and that the level of exports have actually dropped from 42 million in 2022 to 18 million in 2023. Is that a correct categorisation?
You're certainly correct in your broad assumption that, first of all, there's no direct military aid provided by the UK government in a manner that will be familiar to you from the United States. So often when these are discussed in the public prints, these issues, the perception is left that somehow the UK government is directly transferring military equipment. What we're discussing today, as you rightly recognise, is UK-based companies operating under the SELC, under the framework and guidance. In terms of what is the level of export and import from Israel, notwithstanding the horrific events of October the 7th and the appalling aftermath, I'm very happy to write to you to set out the exact numbers that are available to me within DBT.
The stated value of exports at 18 million as of last year, you're not aware of that figure?
I don't have that figure in front of me, and I certainly wouldn't want to mislead you or to mislead the committee.
Some people have stated that to describe the low levels. But Minister Coaker, as Defence Minister, can you elaborate, given the context that we've got a review going on with a small r, can you elaborate and explain further the government statements, and I quote, "The effects of suspending all licences for the F-35 programme would undermine the global F-35 supply chain that is vital for the security of the UK, our allies and NATO." And then it goes on to say that it's not currently possible to suspend licensing of F-35 components for use by Israel without prejudicing the entire global F-35 program. So can you just explain, just to help us understand that?
I will do, but I'll just...
Forgive me for interrupting my colleague, but just I wanted to clarify at the earliest opportunity. I think the figure of £18 million that you mentioned is actually £18.2 million, which is actually military goods exported to a value of 18.2 million. That doesn't reflect general
in 2023. That's the general. Yep. Okay. So going back on, Minister.
Thank you very much for the question. So the F-35 components are made. The Joint Programme Office from the United States will order parts, components that, so for example, ejector seats, rear tail parts of the F-35 programme. They'll order them. They will be made here. They are then exported from the UK to the US, either to assemble the aircraft or to become part of the global pool of parts. As when they leave the UK then loses sight in terms of where they go, but they go into that global pool either for planes to that need them to be replaced or to be assembled as part of the assembly programme for the making of the initial F-35s. So the reason that we say that is all done as part of an international collaboration agreement. We make parts, other countries make parts. There are 9 partner nations in terms of various parts that are made, and then they're assembled together. That is all done as part of a collaboration agreement. The F-35 is currently, so that is done as an agreement. If one part pulls out, that undermines the whole programme. Now, in terms of the F-35, the F-35 is currently involved in all sorts of peace and security operations across the globe, not least with respect to defending the border in terms of what's happened in Ukraine. Yourself and many others have seen the operation of the F-35s from the Prince of Wales aircraft carrier, which is going into the Indo-Pacific next year. All of those, that's just with respect to us. There are all sorts of other countries operating the F-35. It's our understanding that if we withdraw or try to change unilaterally the collaborative agreement, that undermines the whole programme.
I'm fully cognizant of that, and that's probably why the Defence Secretary said that the suspension of F-35 licences would have an impact on, and I quote, a profound impact on international peace and security. So just to clarify, it's only nuts and bolts and ejector seats that we are sending over to the US for the F-35, nothing else.
So it's things like ejector seats, it's things like the rear parts of the tail on the back, batteries, and there are various other parts that go to make up other parts of the aircraft. But the value is something where we estimate the value in terms of what's provided by this country is approximately 15%.
15%. And would we lose a contract if we said no to the US and Lockheed Martin?
The assessment we make is that because we have an international collaboration agreement through the joint programme, it's with the Joint Programme Office who then contract to Pratt Whitney and to Lockheed to actually put either put the planes together or to store the global pools body that then sends out if people need spares or whatever. But we believe that if we unilaterally tried to do that, we would risk being taken out of the overall collaboration of contracts, and that would undermine the whole F-35 project, which at the moment is 1,000 aircraft across the world, and by the end of the project we estimate to be 3,500.
Okay, thank you. Sonia Kumar.
This is Mr. Coaker.
Thank you.
Why are the F-35 parts untrackable?
Well, because when the way the system works, as I explained to the chair of the Defence Committee, the way the system works is that we're contracted to make the components here, and they're made, and then when they leave this country, to go to the US and become the property of the US government, become the property within the US. So we don't track them from them. We lose, in that sense, we lose sight of them once they leave the UK.
Would it be technically possible to actually track them using sort of a NATO codification system?
Excuse me. Well, they are tracked, but they're tracked by the US. The US will track them as to where they go. It's not tracked by the UK.
But they are technically tracked.
They're tracked by the US. The US can track them. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and in sort of the F-35 and not constantly trackable for GPS or in a just-in-time supply chain that you could then see. So from the initial onset of where they've been set off from, and then from another country where they've been deployed.
We don't believe that, as I say, the tracking a device, tracking a part doesn't necessarily mean that a part can be stopped. The only place where the UK, if we're talking about, you can stop parts from entering the programme is at the UK border. That would be, if we're talking about UK components, it's at the border. That's where because once they go out, they're not our property.
And is that a technical issue or a contractual issue?
I think it's part of the arrangement that we have with respect to how the F-35 programme operates.
It's a contractual issue.
I think it's an arrangement.
So the US contract us to provide the components, so we effectively export them to the US. We understand when they go into the US system. Once they're in the US system, the US can track the components.
Whether the US does it. Yes.
Whether they go into building an aircraft or they're into the spares pool, but the UK's got no ability to influence where they go once they're within the US system.
And we
contractually.
Yeah. We have ourselves have no contractual relationship with the US government.
Okay, I understand. Did you want to very briefly?
It seems that our contractual responsibilities to Lockheed Martin are trumping our responsibilities to international humanitarian law. And that is what I think many people on this committee object to. Do you agree with that?
I understand that. I understand the point you're making. Nobody can fail to be moved by the horrific pictures we see on our television screens. What we're saying is a Ministry of Defence, as a Department for Defence, and I'm saying as a Defence Minister, alongside that horror, we also have to consider, which is what the advice that went from the Secretary of State to those who take the decision about export licensing, is the programme that the F-35 is part of, which delivers peace and security in many parts of the world and defends our freedom. And we have to make those judgments, and they're tough judgments to make. So I'm not saying I'm not going to put that against that. I'm just saying these are considerations that we're going to
come back to the framework within that judgment is made in a moment. But Sonia Kumar, do you want to just finish that point?
Sorry,
come
back. Yeah.
So what sort of measures have been put in place to ensure the integrity and security of the F-35 supply chain, particularly with unauthorised transfers of parts to non-partnered nations?
Well, our belief is that the US, the rules and regulations that the US will put in place will prevent the unauthorised use of the parts that we provide. And the US operates according to rules and regulations. It's not free for all with respect to that. They have their own standards, and that we sell into that market, and that's where we believe that those sorts of things that you're concerned about will be dealt with.
Okay, so technically possible. It's not contractually done, but the legality is a question that Antonio Brandt is going to pose.
So can you tell me what the legal basis for the exemption of components for the F-35 programme is, please?
Well, in the strategic framework that my colleagues Mr. Alexander and Mr. Doughty have laid out, there are opportunities for case-by-case exemptions to be made. If you look at the strategic framework, when it was put by I think it was Minister Trevelyan in 2021, she laid out that, of course, notwithstanding the strategic export licensing criteria, that there were actually the ability to, on a case-by-case basis, where it was necessary, you could take into account all of the relevant information available at the time when a licence application is considered.
And this is just supremely important.
Yeah.
That is the legal basis on which this carve-out stands.
Well, it stands on the basis that it is legal for us to act in a way in the way that we are, because laid out in Parliament was the ability to have a case-by-case application applied to different licences.
Okay. This is the first time it's been used?
As far as I am aware, and if I'm wrong, I will be corrected by anybody else who knows.
Yes.
Yeah.
Perhaps I can offer some assistance on the criteria and the basis on which it was used in the written ministerial statement that introduced the criteria in 2021, about which the committee has already spoken. It was set out explicitly by the then Secretary of State that the application of the criteria was without application to specific cases of specific measures. It is under that provision that the Secretary of State has announced to Parliament in a statement of the 2nd of September the departure from the silk and exclusion of the F-35 licences from the scope of the suspension in that case. My understanding is there has been one previous use of that exemption, which was in relation to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Kate, could you confirm that?
Exactly right, as an interim measure while sanctions were put in place on Russia.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, go on.
No, carry on.
So here's our challenge. So despite the without prejudice paragraph that you refer to, which is on page 2 of the statement made on the 8th of December 2021, it says the SELC are set out in terms that suggest actually that they're meant to be comprehensive. It says in terms, these criteria will be applied with immediate effect to all licence decisions. It's unequivocal. The government's summary then, summary grounds of defence in the HoC judicial review, paragraph 24, says applications for new export licences are assessed according to the 8 criteria set out in the SELC. There is no qualification that is mentioned in that judicial review summary. So the challenge that we've got is that we've got two conflicting, colliding and contradictory pieces of information. So on the one hand, you have got a statement of SELC, which is in Minister Trevelyan's statement, and you've set that out in the response to the HoC case. And on the other side, what gives you your latitude is the without prejudice paragraph. And so the challenge that we've got in Parliament is to try and work out which trumps the other.
Of trumping one or the other, it's reading.
Well, it is, because you've carved out the F-35
Forgive me if I can
programme.
finish the answer. It's to read the complete statement offered by Minister Trevelyan to the Commons at the time, in which literally she used the phrase, the application of these criteria will be without prejudice to the application of specific cases of specific measures as may be announced to Parliament from time to time. That without prejudice clause was exercised by the Secretary of State on the 2nd of September in terms of the statement that was offered. So if you like, it was anticipated by a previous government that there could be circumstances, as in the case of the need to address the issue of the Ukraine invasion, or in this case, the F-35 exclusion. So far from deviating from how the statement was described, the written ministerial statement, it seems to me to be exercising and giving expression to the without prejudice clause to which you referred.
But a few moments ago, Mr. Alexander, you described 2C as the cage of red lines within which decisions are taken. And I think what you're now saying is that they are reddish, because actually there's an override that's available, which is the without prejudice section of the guidance.
I'm simply reflecting what's been the stated position both of the previous government and indeed of this government, which is the framework is set out, but there is a without prejudice clause that was identified by Minister Trevelyan and that's been exercised on 2 occasions. First in relation to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and secondly the F-35 exclusion.
Perfect, thank you. Please.
So if the government can unilaterally create exemptions from the SELC, what is there to stop this government and future governments applying what appears to be some sort of business security exemption in applying the criteria in future? And why, given that we are such close allies with the other partners in the F-35 programme, that we are building fighter planes together, why has this government not requested that the US use their tracking capabilities to assure us that British-made parts are not being used in Gaza?
Well, I mean, the overall picture that we've done, there have been, as we say, discussions, always discussions that go on, but the overall assessment that we've made with respect to this, which is why we've applied to the exemptions using the without prejudice clause laid out by that, is that the overall security picture for our nation and the allies that we stand with, given the increased conflict and the increased dangers that we face in the world, require us to apply the exemptions and the without prejudice that Minister Trevelyan has laid out in that statement.
The Minister is on his feet, and so there is a danger that we have a vote called very quickly. So let me just move on from 2C to 1B. So, as you'll know, 1B of the criteria says that the government will not grant a licence if to do so would be inconsistent with the UK's obligations under the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty. Article 7 of that treaty says that if the export is not prohibited, each exporting state party shall have to assess the potential of conventional arms or items could be used to commit or to facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. In those circumstances, the exporting state party shall not authorise the export. So we've gone through to see with a fine-tooth comb, but given what was said at the top of this meeting about the breach of humanitarian law that the government has accepted, given that that has triggered a decision to suspend some arms licences, please can you tell us how your decision making on F-35s is compatible with the obligations on you under 1B and the Arms Trade Treaty, Minister Doughty?
We're absolutely convinced that we're complying with our international obligations.
Help
I'm
us
not
square
going to
this
comment
circle.
on the ongoing process in the judicial review. We've got the whole criteria here. We've got the obligations. Minister Alexander's read out the explanation with the prejudice clause, and Lord Coaker has explained the situation in relation to the F-35s and why that exemption was necessary. So that's all I can say on this at this time.
Well, you have a sub judice waiver, you're protected by the privilege of Parliament, and it would appear to us that, given your assessment that there is a serious risk of a breach of international humanitarian law, it's difficult for us to understand how you're honouring Article 7 of the Arms Trade Treaty. So we would like an explanation of why you think you are acting in line with what seems to us a very clear set of prescriptions in the Arms Trade Treaty.
I mean, as I said, I'm not going to get into the detail of matters that are arguable.
Well, I'm asking you for the detail.
Yeah.
And parliamentary scrutiny and,
yes,
and accountability to
absolutely.
Parliament is a critical bit of the
Completely
legality of your decision taking.
Absolutely, completely understand that, Chair. But we have a series of obligations, as you say, under the Arms Trade Treaty, under our own criteria and others, that are all considered as part of this process. And the advice that we've received, those are consistent with the decisions that have been reached. So that's the position. And I can get into individual clauses in the Arms Trade Treaty or other items, but I don't think it's helpful for us to escape that process here. But we're convinced that there is a very clear basis here for the decisions that have been reached, and that was the advice that was provided. Of course, there's a range of departments involved in these decisions. That advice has been provided to the Secretary of State for Business and Trade. The Secretary of State for Business and Trade has considered those matters and has taken the decision in relation to the licences, including the exemption that Lord Coaker has explained the reasons for. So that's the process. It's got many parts to it, and that's been provided and the decision's been taken.
Well, it's great that you're convinced, but I'd like to understand what the basis of your convictions is.
It's the basis that we've considered all of the legal instruments, all of the considerations that Lord Coaker has set out and that Minister Alexander has set out. And that's the decision then that's reached. It's reached on the totality of all of the evidence that's provided, the legal advice that's provided, the information from all those different pieces of information that are provided, and the wider context that Lord Coaker has set out. And then that's taken a holistic decision. The Secretary of State then takes that decision.
But the Arms Trade Treaty is really clear. It says that if there is an overriding risk of an international humanitarian law breach, the exporting state party shall not authorise the export. Your guidance says, criterion 1B, the government will not grant a licence if to do so would be inconsistent with the UK's obligations under the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty. In your submission to the courts on the 15th of November, it says in black and white that the government accepts that the F-35 exports may be used to breach international humanitarian law. So you've said it yourself, and I cannot understand how you can see it as compatible with your obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty.
We've set out the case, we've set out the reasons for the decision, the totality of all of the legal obligations, the context on the ground, and the reasons that Lord Coaker set out has been considered. It's been considered in the round, and that's what the Secretary of State for Business and Trade has made the decision on the basis of.
Okay. Well, there is a vote in the House, and so this sitting is suspended. If there was a case of Saved by the Bell, I think this is it. I'm not convinced, Minister Doughty, by your explanation of the UK's compatibility between this decision and the Arms Trade Treaty, I'm afraid. And that will obviously be debated in the House on Monday on the basis of the transcript that we have seen. But you have presented your evidence before us today, and that is on the record. Thank you to all of our ministers for coming along. Kate, Stephen, and colleagues, thank you so much for being here. That concludes this session. Order.